Okay, the course content which we're trying to cover today are about the introduction to servlets, like exactly what a servlet is, what is the life cycle of a servlet, and then two main classes which are related to servlets, which are on the boundary of say definition, in the sense that they're not exactly servlets, but they help in the configuration, etc. So we'll look into the details of them slowly. So let's move ahead. Now the introduction of the servlets is, say, and I think in one of the introductory demo classes as well, if you would have attended them earlier, was about servlets, I guess, where I introduced a bit exactly as to what servlet means. So there, Java is just a language, right? It's just a programming language, so it can cater to multiple things. And if Java is catering to say web requests, okay, so if it is catering to web requests, it means that when you go on your browser, right, and say you type the same, like say www.gmail.com, there is something out there which is a server, and I explained this in the last class as well, which actually listens to such requests and forwards it appropriately. So the first page which comes up, maybe there is a difference in the way in which the web server and the application server will be used, right? So the web server is catering to web requests. So whenever you type www.gmail.com, it goes to the web server. Web server knows that there is one Gmail application, maybe a application installed somewhere on the server, and it needs to redirect the request to that server. So that is a requirement, right? And for doing that, the web server and application server, they both collaborate together. So once the request reaches the application in the application server, okay. So what next? Not every program can listen to it, right? Like say if you are writing a hello world program, you go and write a main method in the class file, do a right click, run as Java main application and run it, right? So it's done in that phase, and so they specifically know that which file has to be run. So in the case of web applications, say if you are hitting www.gmail.com and it reaches the application which is there in the application server, what next? There can be thousands of classes. Which class is going to cater to this one? So that is not clear, first of all, and second of all, even if there are thousands of classes, there has to be one exact class which has to cater to it, right? So all that configuration is done in the web application if it is Java based, okay? And the classes, the type of classes which listens to such web requests are called servlets, okay? The servlets are the one which listens to such requests, and they are the ones which will first get all the requests. Anyways, I think in the last class as well we discussed about web.xml. So web.xml, as I told, is the most important file in a web application if you are writing it using Java. So in the web application you define about servlets, alright. So when you define about servlet, what I mean is that you give the name of the servlet and the class file, okay. This combination is mentioned. Second thing which is mentioned is apart from the name and class file, the URL mapping, which means that if this is a URL, then this particular servlet will listen to it. Alright. So, and all these things are bundled in one application, right? Because all these things which I explained above, which are marked with hyphen in this board, they are part of web.xml itself. So if it is bundled in a web application, so once the request comes from the browser, so it flows like this: browser to application, from application web.xml comes into picture. In fact, web container comes into picture. The web container is part of browser to application server, and then within application server you have web container, and the web container which is out there, that actually loads the application and takes care of all the web needs. So this web container, this one, when the application was getting deployed, at that time itself, it does some configuration. Plus, whenever a request comes in, a web request comes in, web container is the one which checks the web.xml file to find out which is a servlet which will cater to this particular request, and then the control goes to that particular servlet. Okay, so the idea is that once the application, once the control hits application, web.xml comes into picture, and then you can look into the web.xml to find out that if this is a URL, what is the servlet which will look into it. Okay, so this mapping you can find from the web.xml, and from there it will become clear to you, because application server, web container, all these things, it is, hidden from you. It's very good for understanding, but it's not that in day-to-day life you need to look into it. Plus the servlet specification, like say Java as such is has become a government, right? So government comes with policies, and then we all follow those policies. Like the business has to be done in this particular way, you need all these licenses, and then you go ahead and use them. Same cases with Java. They come up with the specifications that any provider of the servlets has to adhere to these parameters. And if they adhere to those parameters, to those logic, to those points, your coding is not dependent on the application server or the web container. So actually this point is moot. For understanding it's fine, but you do not need to know about it on day-to-day basis, and not even about web container. What you need to know about is that when an application hits, when a browser or when a particular URL hits your application, which is a servlet which will look into that particular request. And to find that out, you just need this web.xml. There, using this URL pattern, like say slash, www.equifax.com/login. So slash login, which is a servlet which is related to it. Okay, and if you once you find a servlet name, what is the class file which will cater to it. So all those details can be found from here. And even the web container, not only like you and me will be using this web.xml, but even the web container uses the web.xml to find out the exact class file. It loads the class file and executes the code from there. Okay, so this is on high level, like what I'll say, the introduction of servlets. The next thing which I want to deal about is like say servlets. So servlets, like say how to develop them. Alright, so to develop the servlets, what you need is say there is one specification, as I told, right? So that specification says that the servlet has to be written in this particular way. So Java as such, they have provided one servlet specification, and that servlet specification has led to one servlet contract. So in one of the Java jars, you'll find javax dot I'm forgetting the name, and then dot servlet. Now this is the interface which contains all the methods, okay, which every servlet has to implement. Okay. Now by default they have given one implementation for it, which is called as generic servlet. Okay, and this generic servlet implements the basic has a basic implementation for all the methods defined in the servlet interface. So this is an interface. So this is an interface. So every like all the methods are implemented using generic servlet. Okay, and there's some specific implementation, like say there's some other methods which are also implemented, like some specific configuration for receiving HTTP requests, and that is by extending this generic servlet. So HTTP servlet extends generic servlet, okay, and generic servlet implements this servlet interface which I was talking about. Now, if you are writing your own class, like say my servlet, if you're writing that my servlet class, you just need to extend HTTP servlet, and all the basic functionality will get inherited. So you need not do anything much. So what you need to do extra is that there's a method do get, okay, which because you're extending you have to inherit and implement, and the other one is do post. So these methods are there for which, I mean, by default one implementation is there. That might not be sufficient because obviously if you're writing servlets you are expecting like some custom logic, right? So by default the implementation doesn't have much thing, so you need to have some logic for inside this do get or do post. So there is a difference between get and post, and that also I like to explain here. And that difference is that say whenever you might have seen some URLs where even the user ID, password, etc. is input is there in the URL itself. Okay, so if it is there in the URL, like user ID, user ID, password, or any other such details, and anyone can look at it, right? Because in the URL itself using ampersand etc. it's appended, so it's one particular line. So anyone intercepting the request can find out what is your user ID, password, etc. So and this is very lightweight because everything is there in the one URL. There is no payload to that particular browser request. Okay, so it's lightweight. We can prefer it, but there are some uh, there are some cons to it. So in the sense that even if you use it, there is a lot of security risk. To avoid that, we go ahead with the post. So what does post do is that it posts the form. So if you have 2-3 fields, you can post the form. The URL, there's no information which goes in the URL. URL will still be www.gmail.com or www.equifax.com/login. The only thing which will go is that in the values which you are sending, alright, the values which you are sending, those values will be encoded in the body of the HTML request. It will not be in the URL. So in that ways, it's less prone to security risks than as compared to GET API. But anyways, for simplicity, they mentioned both, and in many cases you might not be sending the secure information every time. So in that case, a GET request will do and will work fine. So it depends on your needs, like which one you want to use. But you can either have a logic here, you can either have a logic here, or maybe you can have a logic in a common place, and from both these methods, you just call that particular method. So anything of this sort is possible. So this is how we write a particular server. Now coming back, and this server is capable of handling everything. So when you say a do get method, it accepts one HTTP servlet request. Okay, now this request is there, and there's one response which is expected, HTTP servlet response. Okay, so when the browser comes up with a request, it is expecting a response, right? So that request object is denoted using this one, HTTP servlet request. And once you work on this request, you look forward for the response, right? And once you look forward for the response, when that response comes in, you send the response back to the browser, and browser uses that response to structure the things which it has to show on the UI, the HTML page, the final HTML page, and this is what you see on the UI. So anything which is in the request, like say username, password, etc., once it reaches the my servlet class, which is by extending the HTTP servlet, it will be present in your request. So that is represented by HTTP servlet class. Okay. Now the thing is that it is represented by HTTP servlet class. So this request, if you go and see, it has certain attributes. It has certain methods. Let's say get parameter, request the get attribute. So whenever you are passing say user ID, password, etc., they are set as parameters in the request, and here in the code you can access that using request.getParameter. So that's how you retrieve and access all the all the dynamic things which you get from the UI. Okay, and whatever is there in do get, similarly you have for do post. So that's it for like how to write a servlet. Now coming back to some other stuff is like say now we were discussing about servlet config and servlet context. So there are two things which is an extra we need to cover in today's class. So we go to servlet config. What is servlet config? So servlet config is, both of them are related to configuration, both servlet config as well and servlet context as well. But there's a difference. So the servlet context is shared across all the servlets. Okay, and servlet config is per servlet. So if you have only some servlet level configuration, you can put it in like it will be represented using servlet config class. And if you have some information which will be shared across all the servlets, then it is represented using servlet context class. So that is the only difference. Okay, now say how, like what is the significance? It's fun that servlet config is the one which represents the configuration information per servlets, and servlet context is the one which represents the information which is shared across servlets. But where is this information out there which has to be represented either by servlet config class or servlet context class? Where is that information? So servlet config class, alright, so servlet config class information which is there per servlets. Now again, the most important file in the web application is web.xml, and once you have web.xml, what is more important is that you will find init hyphen param tags inside the web.xml, okay, at the servlet level. Now this stands for initialization parameters, but the tag is like this, and inside this tag you have name value pairs, and those name value pairs you can specify the initialization parameters and the and the basic code which is there for the servlets. That one loads the initialization parameters into a servlet config object and makes it available for the servlet to use. So from your my servlet class, whatever I was explaining before, which is by extending the HTTP servlet class, you have a reference, you have a way to get a servlet config object, and from there you can refer to all these initialization parameters. Okay, so in the same way you can also access servlet context class from your my servlet class. Okay, and there is one tag which is at the, not exactly at the servlet level, one step above, which is context param, and that has information which is loaded into servlet context object. You can get this information, and this information can be used by any servlet which is there in the web application, because this is not at the servlet level. Okay, so if you see the topics which were there, one was introduction, so I explained you in detail what exactly is a servlet. The second thing was servlet life cycle, which we'll see shortly. Third thing was servlet context, alright, and then you have servlet config. So we discussed all of these, right? And servlet life cycle is closely dependent upon the web container. So basically, whenever you have a servlet class, right? Now, say you're writing an application for Amazon, and they are catering to maybe during Thanksgiving, maybe 100 million transactions per day. So it means that maybe 100 million people, or maybe one people logging in number of times in the same day, are trying to access the web application which they have, and give back the results. Alright, so that is the information which they require. Now, will if it is a Java application, will this Java application create as many servlets as the as the number of users which are there? If 100 million users come in, will we go ahead and create 100 million servlet instances? The answer is no. We will be creating only few. There is a servlet pool which the web container maintains, and all this work is taken care by the web container itself. So it's the work of the underlying code base. So it doesn't have to interfere with what you have to do. But what happens is that they instantiate only few of the servlets. In the sense that for a particular servlet, there can be maximum 3 or 4 or something of that sort. There is no limit as such. I'm just explaining and giving an example. There is 3-4 instances, and these instances will cater to all the requests. Okay, so yeah, so that's how it works. And in fact, there is a scenario. I mean, it can be the case that there is only one instance. You might not even need more instances. So it depends upon how the web container, which is part of the application server, is implementing such logic. But you can have one or more instances. Ideally, even one instance will do. You do not need more than one instance. So when the application is deployed, at that time some information is loaded up. One of those informations is ServletContext object that is loaded up during the project deployment itself. Now, whenever you're trying to hit the particular URL for the first time, so the web container goes and checks whether it already has an instance available for serving the request. If not, it instantiates one. Okay. So while doing that instantiation, we need some initialization work to be done. Okay, you can call this ServletConfig object. You can load it at that time, or maybe some other work has to be done. But if it has to be done, that will be taken care during initialization phase. So once initialization is done, the next step is catering to service requests. So whatever request comes in, I mean, every time we do not execute that initialization value, it always goes to the service method, and the service method takes care of executing all the requests. Okay, and once the requests are catered, once we are done with the catering of the request, like say web application is shutting down, at that time destroy method is called, so that the servlet instance is nullified and it is available for garbage collection, so that there is no memory consumption. So this is the idea behind a servlet lifecycle. Alright, so servlet lifecycle starts with the project deployment when you load ServletContext at that time. Okay, this is one case. The second is during initialization you execute the init method. Alright, then there is a service method which caters to all the requests. So you can ask me a question if you go back to the earlier explanation which I was giving about the myServlet class. Now myServlet class was extending HTTP servlet, and you were implementing do get and do post. But I am emphasizing again and again that the method here is service, and during initialization we have init methods. Where are those methods in myServlet class which I was writing? So the answer is that the service method by default, like say whenever you're getting requests from browser, it can come via different APIs, via different methods. One method which we discussed in detail right now was about get requests, right? Similarly, you have post. Apart from that, we have two more types of requests. So these are the very basic level of requests which it receives. So from the service method, which already is implemented by the HTTP servlet class which we are extending, you can access they have defined methods such as do get, do post, do head, do put. Sorry, this is put. I'm very sorry about this. Do put, and inside that you mention your actual code. All right. Now inside this you're mentioning your actual code. Now here you get all the coding done. Now if you want some information to initialize, you can override init method as well, and we have given some methods that might not be suitable for you, just a default implementation. You can go ahead and provide an implementation for this one as well. you can override this method as well. Okay, so this is all about, and this is once the service is done, you call it and when I say you, I don't mean you, the web container calls a destroy method to nullify the resources, to free up the resources which are held up by the servlet. So this is about the servlet lifecycle. Then we discuss the servlet context and servlet config. So this is in short all about the session, the things which we'll be discussing today. Okay, so let's go back to the material and see what all we have. So when we log into a website to check our email, we provide our credentials. These credentials are sent over to the web server, which redirects a request to the application server. Application server hosts the code which caters to such requests. So this is what we were discussing as well, right? And the server-side programs which listens to such requests from the browser are, and I'm very sorry about this mistake, are servlets. So okay, so in Java we use servlets to cater to such requests. To access a servlet, we first need to code it, compile it, and then deploy it. Alright, and that deployment is basically saying that you deploy it to the web application, which has a web.xml and the specific structure which we discussed in the last class. The application server provides the web container to manage various components of web application, such as HTML page and servlets. A web container provides a runtime environment for running a servlet. So this is the diagram which will explain how it works. So web client, like say like browser, Mozilla, Safari, IE8, IE9, these are web clients. Now they send a HTTP request, and this is a web container, which is, this they are showing as web server, but all the things which I mentioned here is part of the web container. Okay, so it caters to the HTTP request. It gets converted into HTTP server request object, which I was explaining earlier. All right, and then there's some work on top of it. Yeah, you can insert it in the DB also. Then you create this HTTP servlet response and send it back to the web client so that it can show that structured information over to the user. Okay, so the other way to represent is you code in the front end using JSPs, JSF, and other such things which are available, which is represented here. But the code which listens to such, JSPs are the front end logic, right? So it's actually the server, but that is used to form the HTML response, the presentation of the HTML response, and send it back to the user. But within that, there are servlets which actually listens, and servlet is the one which actually invokes these JSP pages so that that response can be created, which you have to show to the end user. Okay, now the working with servlet. So this is how a servlet works. So whenever now this is a web container. So whenever a request comes in, the first time the web container loads the servlet class. Any initialization thing is done at the next, as a next step. Then the servlet instance is basically created, and then you pass the HTTP servlet request object to this instance, and then here you have all the business logic. You create the response here itself in the servlet class, and then you send the response back to the client, and the client here is the browser. Okay, so this is how a servlet works. So web container checks for the instance of the servlet. Once it receives a request to serve a particular URL for which we need the instance of a particular server, particular servlet. So if the instance exists, request is delegated to the appropriate servlet. Otherwise, an instance of the servlet is created. After initialization, such an instance starts sending the request. Web container passes a response generated by the servlet back to the browser. Browser then displays a response in a structured way to the end user. So this is as per we discussed. Now coming back to the life cycle of the servlet. So this is the root interface which I was talking about. javax.servlet.servlet. This is a root interface. This is a basic interface which every servlet has to implement. Okay. Now coming back here, you see here. Now this is a ServletConfig class which we are discussing. Serializable is an interface which every generic servlet implements, and then servlet is an interface which is say a way to show which all methods are mandatory for every servlet to implement. So generic implementation has been given in the generic servlet. HTTP protocol specific information is there in the HTTP servlet class, and then you write your own servlet class, my servlet, X servlet, Y servlet, whatever you want to name it, This is a user-defined class by extending the HTTP servlet. So all the basic work is already catered here in the HTTP servlet. You extend it and do some of the other work. Okay. So most of the times we'll be extending the HTTP servlet class. You do not need to note the gory details, but what we explain about the life cycle on the board and here what is written below will help you enhance the understanding. But you may not encounter such things on day-to-day basis. Okay, so web container loads a servlet class and creates an instance of it. This is the first time. During the instance creation, servlet is initialized as well. To initialize the servlet, web container invokes the init method of the servlet instance. Whenever a web request comes in, the web container invokes the service method to allow a servlet to process a client request. When the service method processes the request and sends the response back to the web client, and the same two steps, 3 and 4, are repeated for all the requests which this servlet is catering to. But once done, we call the destroy method, alright, and that once this method is executed, the destroy method, the servlet instance stops catering to any more requests. So either we need to create new servlets or whatever be the case, but this servlet instance, its job is done. Okay. Now this is the signature of the init method which is catering to such requests. Okay, so public void init ServletConfig through servlet exception. So the web container, once it tries to create the instance of the servlet, at that time whatever are the values present inside that init-param tag, it loads that values into the ServletConfig class and makes it available to the init method, which is basically responsible for running the initialization code of this servlet. Okay, now this is what is we implement now, and this is how we get the access to the parameters which are set in the init which are set in the web.xml. Now service method is, the signature is this: public void servlet, servlet request and servlet response are the two attributes. Alright, and then when the generic servlet implements it, when generic servlet is extended by the HTTP servlet, that particular HTTP servlet class is also having an implementation for the service method. The signature of this which is described here, and this is a copy paste mistake from my end. It should not be in it should be service. And then you have the reference there which the HTTP servlet class is implementing is HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. Okay, and that request has all the parameters which are set on the UI. The service method dispatches a client request to one of the request handler methods of the HTTP servlet interface, such as the doGet, doPost, doHead or doPut, and this is what I was talking about earlier. Alright, now coming here, say a ServletConfig interface. Now the ServletConfig interface is the this I think we've already discussed before. So this is web container creates an object of the ServletConfig for each servlet. So this is not for each container, this is for each servlet. Okay, and this object stores the configuration information from the web.xml file. Okay, and web.xml contains a section, as I explained earlier, init-param, and these parameters are stored in the ServletConfig object, which is instance which is created by the web container. So we have an access to the ServletConfig object during servlet initialization. In the init method, you have the ServletConfig as the input parameter, right? And we can retrieve such init param values and set it appropriately. Now this is the example which I have. Now notice everything which is out here, web.xml. So there is one parent tag, web app, and inside that you have all these servlets defined. So name is defined. This name can be X, Y, Z, Y, A, B, C, whatever. And this is a servlet class, the name of the class which you have actually used for coding. Now init parameters are the things which are referenced by the ServletConfig object. And remember, ServletConfig is per servlet, so it is not for all the servlets. This information is shared. This information is per servlet. So if you see the tag starts from here, the servlet, it ends here. It has various the sub tags are servlet hyphen name, servlet hyphen class, and then you have init-param. So init-param has param name and param values. Alright, now this is the one which is loaded as key value pairs with a ServletConfig class, and it's available for you to use. Okay, so you can use this value to initialize or do some data pooling, data connection pooling at the startup. So that can be done. Now second thing just discussing about is servlet mapping. Now inside the servlet mapping you have the servlet name, and then you have the URL pattern. So whenever a particular URL comes in, you can find that if this is a pattern, this is servlet which is created to it. If this is the name of the servlet, alright, what is the actual class, and then go in your source code and look for this particular class. Alright, so this is a typical flow which you can understand from a web.xml file. Now if you see this, the servlet class snapshot which I have provided, they are implementing the doGet method, and the two parameters are HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. Okay, and here if you see the response, they provide one writer API, and you can do a get servlet config, which is available because of this get because it is there in the HTTP servlet request, which can be used. Okay, and it gives you a handle to servlet config object, and from this config you can dot get init parameter, and give the name of, gives a key value, let's say here driver, and get that driver value. Alright, so in this way if you see about this driver value is configured here, so we are able to get this value per servlet, and this value is inside within init-parameter, init-para object. Now there are two configurations which we discussed earlier in the class today. One was about ServletConfig, and the other one is about ServletContext. So ServletConfig is per servlet, but ServletContext is for the entire gamut of servlets which is available for that web application. Alright, now coming back to the ServletContext, there is only one ServletContext object per web application. Web container creates this when the project is deployed. ServletContext object is used to get the configuration information from web.xml, which will be available to any servlet or JSP that are part of the web application. Now again, let's see the request, and if you once you see the snapshots or the actual code, it will become much more clearer. So coming back to this one, if you see the tag which is used here is context-param. So basically in short we just say as context parameter, but the context-param is for the whole application. You put the values which you need here. So once you put the values you need here, and if you see here, this is outside the servlet definition. So once you define the values like this, see the context-param, and it is outside the servlet definitions. So once you do that from the code, again see the doGet method is implemented. Here you are getting get ServletContext API, which is by default implemented in the HTTP servlet class, and using that you can get the reference to ServletContext, and then you can get all the initialization parameters, driver name, etc., and then you can use it. Alright, so HTTP servlet class from its own end doesn't know what to do with the parameters which you're trying to set for all the servlets, which is via ServletContext, or for one particular servlet which is via ServletConfig. So it only gives you a handle to access such values from your code, but from here whether you need to set some class level variables or you need to have some business logic, it all depends upon you. Okay, so that's why you can get a handle to ServletContext, get the values which are stored in the context-param tag, and then work on it, but nothing more than that. Alright, so this is all about ServletContext. So this is, I think, what we have for today about the ServletConfig. So let's go back and see which are things which we discussed. So we discussed about servlets introduction, how the life cycle should be. We discussed about the ServletConfig and the ServletContext. I think pretty much this is all what is out there for on high level for servlets. If you want to write the basic servlets, you can use it in write. And for today we don't have any questions because you already have an assignment pending. Plus the servlet thing is broken down into two sessions. So there is next session is also about servlets, where we'll discuss about servlet filters, servlet listeners, and once we do that much, you'll get some idea about the complete end-to-end scenario which is related to servlets, and you can write your own servlet. So that's why we have not taken it for today's class. So that's it for today's class. If you have any questions,